Ready to rock and roll. Let's go. Okay, so this is another community call for Phoenix Library, and this one today is going to be recorded as all others are, and you can go back over it, look at it, whatever frequency and whatever speed you want, and feel free to ask any questions, and also reach out if there's anything that you need in the community or also to me directly. So this one is somewhat topical because we're going to be talking about the emotional impact during festive seasons. Now, when we are with clients, festive seasons may look different. We're obviously entering into a festive season at the moment, which is Christmas, but these can be different festive seasons or different times when families or celebrations come together, which are varied in their sense. Weddings, um, christenings, it could be, different cultures of different festivals that happen at different times of the year. So it's not, although this is being run out now just leading up to Christmas, the principles, tools, and outlook of all of these are essentially applicable at different types of season. I have made this rather festive for Christmas though, and I have put in 11 films that you would likely see around the festive period. So just as a little jovial kind of guesswork slash quiz, you might want to see which films are which as we move through, but that's just because I'm festively fun. So what emotion best describes you and how you usually experience festive seasons? Now, we can look at this as one word sum up, or it might be a sentence sum up, but just having an idea around what the festive season actually brings up for you as the coach, or as a team leader, or as an individual. Now, if we think about some of how we might have had recent clients leading up to Christmas, we might have a few more sessions with clients, or as the festive parties are happening within our workplaces, we might be thinking about how other team members or people who report into us, or how our clients might be approaching Christmas and what do they feel about the festive period. But the question is, and this is a really important one, is do you actually know? Have you had coaching conversations or team conversations with individuals within your team around how they are actually feeling about Christmas? What do they actually think about Christmas and how they perceive it? What emotions come up? And do they struggle or do they roll into the festive period arms wide open and jovial and full of joy? It's a point of conversation that is incredibly important to be able to add depth to your relationships that you have with the people around you from a professional, maybe also from a personal perspective as well. So what does an emotional landscape look like for one of our clients? What does it look like for one of our team members? And how can we understand what they're experiencing or what aspects might be in play so on the landscape? So when we think about overwhelm and overstimulation, the festive season is a big thing when it comes to amplifying the senses and their emotional load. There's a lot of social events that happen. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of logistics of planning. You go into crowded environments. There's often a case of having to make multiple decisions about different things at different times. And I've already got several clients that I've been working with, which are I would classify on the brink of full system fatigue, where they are running most of their bandwidth and they don't have a huge amount left to give. And I think that from a coaching lens perspective, helping the client to recognize these early signs of overwhelm, or it could be in the body, tight chest, short fuse, mental fog, withdrawal, or any of these things, to recognize uh, before it really takes hold too much, and normalize the impact of seasonal intensity, and help to support them around building boundaries or making the right decisions that are meaningful to them, planning little pauses, um, saying yes, but having a certain amount of parameters around that yes. It's not a yes and now I'll do anything. It's a yes, but this is my setup. So, we're going to come on to a few specific tools later on, but ultimately, if you think about how overwhelm and overstimulation can really come into play quite quickly within the festive period, family dynamics and relational triggers. So, Christmas often does reunite individuals. Old patterns can come up, unspoken expectations or emotionally loaded histories with brothers and sisters or uncles, aunties, whatever. A client might revert back to an outdated family role. Could be one of many things, fixes, peacekeeper, a quiet one. Whatever it is, that can have an activation on some like emotional regression. So things that you might have been working on, managing different kind of emotional responses in different scenarios, actually going back into that environment really does put the pressure on and really amps up the difficulty in being able to run those protocols that you've decided to run with them during those tricky times. Going back to Christmas or going back to into a festive period around family really does crank up the difficulty of being able to apply them sometimes. So sometimes we need to get them to explore some of those patterns before you go back into those spaces, and that can really help and help to name some of those things that might come up, help to name some of those almost neurological patterns that have never been got rid of, but ultimately may be easily found and gone into the groove of them again once they're back in that environment. So being aware of them and actually having a conversation about them is a really important thing to be able to do. Boundaries and guilt. So we often go into certain festive periods and seasons with this socially coded generosity, and the generosity isn't necessarily about the taking presents to people and stuff like that, which is often part of it, but it's more to do with about saying yes and constantly showing up for people when that's not necessarily the right thing to do. And it can take a lot out of an individual very quickly, and therefore having some sort of boundary in place. However, when we think about the festive season, and let's take Christmas for example, I'm working with someone at the moment who's trying to streamline where they're going and who they're seeing. But the real issue that's come up is that there are so many people reaching out, going, "Oh, let's meet up before Christmas. Let's make sure we meet before Christmas." And there is this almost sense of guilt that that person is carrying if they don't respond in the way which is enthusiastic or at least committing to meeting up before Christmas. I don't want to disappoint them. I don't want them to think I'm not trying, or I don't want them to think that I'm selfish. But where we are working with clients, we need to make sure they have some level of clarification between them being kind to someone else or abandoning themselves in a sense of just like going from one thing to the next. And it's where a lot of people lose their momentum of assertiveness over Christmas or over a festive period or going into family events. They are almost put into a position where they become supplicative to other people's needs, and therefore, they don't get to the gym, they don't eat well, or they don't sleep enough, or they don't give themselves time to recharge. And it's part of the coaching lens to look through is where are my clients making decisions that are benefiting them as well as the social landscape that they're on, but that's not pushing them to the point of, mental fatigue or burnout or making poor decisions one after the other around their mental well-being or their health. So I've often had conversations with clients about loneliness or being alone, and what does that actually mean, and how does that actually proliferate into a particular environment. Because if you're in a busy room and there's lots of people around, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are feeling surrounded by people, you can still feel very emotionally alone or isolated, especially if, some people are very different from their families and they go into a period of time where they don't necessarily feel like they're super connected, and that can actually feel quite lonely for them. And loneliness is a real problem with the broader sense within society. It's one of the most dangerous things that can actually have an impact on individuals. And therefore, when you go into an environment where there might be pockets of people, or there might be people that have connections, and you're comparing those connections, or you're feeling quite isolated, that can be an incredibly destabilizing thing from an emotional point of view. And then you think about the coping mechanisms that come into play. What do people choose to do when they do feel lonely, when they have compared, different Christmases that are happening, or festive gatherings that are happening to their own? How does that actually manifest in the choices and decisions and behaviors that they make? And can we see that as a coach? Can we support that as a coach? And can we put something in place which is actually going to be worthwhile to ensure that person has a more robust position and gets through that particular tricky period of time with a little bit more fortitude? So, continuing to look across the emotional landscape that we might see for a festive period, financial pressure and shame can often play a role when we think about the consumerism aspect, gift buying, or having to travel a long way, lots of food, social expectations. It can create a certain amount of stress from a financial point of view, and some people feel they should be able to afford more. Some people feel they should be bringing more. They should be traveling further. They should be doing all these different things. And that can often have a real pressure on an individual. You might find that people have to stop training or over a Christmas period because actually they need to spend money on presents, or that's what they feel they need to do. That's where they are in a position of changing where they might be spending their money. Now, when you think about it from a coaching lens perspective, the real win here is to be able to support the clients from detaching their self-worth from spending. And that's something that takes time and takes the relationship and an ongoing work with an individual, because it's a lot about values aligned gifting rather than and having a boundary on how much people are spending, but then having a certain amount of robustness so that you don't come away from that and you stay true. I'll give you a personal example. I've got to a particular age now where I don't really want stuff, and I would much rather spend time with people. I've got two nieces, and I always say to them every year, Christmas or birthday, I can give you this amount of money if you want, and you can go and do whatever you want with it. Or I will meet you somewhere, we'll go out to for an activity, and then we'll grab some food after and spend like half the day, a day, in each other's company, building an experience and a memory. Now, that itself is much more fulfilling and values aligned for me personally. And like having conversations like that with clients over the years, people have tended to like appreciate that and move into that a little bit more, which they've had to then explain that in some way, shape, or form to the people that they're um, going to meet this festive period. But that is a balance of them not feeling shameful. That's the decision they're making. So it's quite an intricate thought process when it comes to how, and what emotions come up around financial pressure and decisions around like values aligned gifting and such forth. But it's just an interesting consideration when we're working with clients. Grief and memory is something that a lot of people have certain attribution to quite difficult emotional times over leading up to Christmas or during Christmas even. And when we think about loved ones or relationships that have gone in the past, which are now absent, that can often become quite a tricky time for people to navigate. And we think about how people cope with that. what is the strategy that's in place for clients that are going into an area or a space or an environment where they are going to feel loss. They are going to have that grief coming back up for a particular reason of a lost loved one and the memories that come with that. Now, of course, there are going to be positive memories. This isn't all about, the negative aspects of um, the festive period, but there are going to be memories which will create emotional responses, sadness, melancholy. There might even be some, frustration because of the different things which have happened in the past. And ultimately, when you have these emotions come up, it's how you sit with them and what you do with them during this time and how you respond or how you react can be the difference between maladaptive or adaptive coping strategies within this particular period. So, in a coaching lens, you're almost asking the client to invite that grief without necessarily rushing to fix it because it's a normal thing that's going to happen. We all lose loved ones and we experience the loss of loved ones within, those heightened times of Christmas or festive periods, birthdays, weddings, and such forth. So, helping someone to have an adaptive coping strategy or a new ritual where they can honor that memory and it not be consuming for them and then making the wrong decisions and not being able to cope. Now, disrupted routines, and then, well, I put in there a bit of an identity wobble because for many clients, a festive period, if it's leading up to parties, weddings, or Christmas, it doesn't really matter, but leading up to it can have a real disruption on a regular routine or set of structure that they have over weeks or months and such forth, depending on how long the festive period is or the lead up to it is. And that can actually have a little bit of emotional instability, especially if within the health, fitness, and well-being. Sometimes people can feel a real pressure to fit everything in, or they might not, and therefore they might lose some level of momentum and they might feel they're going backwards. So when you have an individual that's working hard towards goals and then the routine naturally becomes disrupted because of external things that are happening, which you can't shut down away from everything that's festive and going on. There has to be a certain amount of engagement, you would imagine, to that. But it's okay that it's normalized and it's okay to have strategies and plans in place which are adaptable. So the client can still anchor positive habits or they can still see certain progress in certain aspects. It might just be being a little bit clearer on getting out, doing some walking or making sure they're well hydrated, and also a little bit of psychology where you can have good reflection and acceptance through this period of time if the routine is disrupted. And that's very difficult for some people who are very switched on to routine and are very anchored to it. When it changes, actually the skill as a coach that we should be supporting them with is not, oh, you should try and keep your routine, you should try and keep your routine. It's more to do with, okay, the routine's changing. Let's be malleable with that. What can we do with that in order to allow the client to be more accepting and have a certain amount of emotional regulation around things like frustration or annoyance or anger or any of those that might come up because of a disrupted routine. We consider emotional numbing. Now, we're obviously going to be subjected over a festive period to food, alcohol. It might be watching films when it comes to screen time, for example. And you can find that clients that I've spoken to over the years, they have very fixed strategy when they're going like when it comes to what they're going to eat and the alcohol they're going to drink. And that can be both positive or negative. Some can go in and be like very, I'm just going to have this, and this, that'll be fine. Others can go in and be, oh, I'm just going to go for it, I'm going to go mad. Now, whichever decision and any of the decisions in between that clients makes is absolutely down to them. It's their prerogative. Some people really like to go for it at Christmas, and other people like to, have a bit of restriction for their own mental well-being or their own physical well-being. But the key factor here is it's a conscious decision that they're making, and it's not about overly controlling something, and it's not about numbing something. So it's not about deflecting a behavior, and it's not about numbing or soothing, and it's a conscious decision they're making. So it comes about because you're going into a period of potentially emotional discomfort, and the festive period really does provide plenty of opportunity for forms of numbing or soothing that actually masks true emotional signals. But from a coaching lens perspective, approaching this with a certain amount of empathy, never shame, and exploring what the drive is behind that behavior. Is it to ease the emotion in that moment? Is it to protect you from something? But this small amount of awareness opens the door for the opportunity to create better coping strategies. Now, just want to focus in on a couple of specific ones which can happen to clients. Now, when we have clients that come back to us post-festive period that might have experienced some of these things, it's almost a residual and shadow impact that might last longer than the festive period itself. You might go for a week or you might go for a few days, but the actual festive period could also entail, a month worth, a couple of weeks leading up to. So the length of whatever the festive period is can be very varied. But during this festive period, if you have things like a certain amount of shutdown or over functioning, then you might find that this takes a little bit of time for a client to get out of. In a way, if you have good coping strategies before you go into these situations, then it should only be a blip, so to speak. But ultimately, if the coping strategies aren't that great or haven't worked, or the length of time is quite long, then you can find that this, uh, getting back into the routine, as people say, can sometimes take a bit of time, longer than one would potentially want. So when we think about how all of these things that we just mentioned on the landscape create this emotional overload, you can find there's a bit of a shutdown with clients, and that can be a withdrawal or a go quiet. There's maybe some sort of disconnect, and it's not where they're avoiding anything in particular. It's just that they're shutting down, their nervous system's at capacity. And when we, as coaches, hear some of these uh, sentences when we come back from working with our clients, it's like, I found it really hard to deal with things, or quite a bit of time I just didn't want to be around anyone, or it felt a bit foggy, felt a bit blank. And these are some of the things that we should be listening for when clients return back from their festive period. Now, it's part and parcel of us as coaches to be able to have a impact on them where we can. And that can actually be, depending on what your SAP is as coaching, it could be some like just drop in messages. It could be just, depending on the relationship and the connection that you have with your clients, you could just, if you know there's some clients which will struggle, you could just give them a little bit of a kind of message to obviously wish them that they're having a good time, but also to keep them, on some of the strategies that you might discuss to avoid this shutdown post festive period lull, so to speak. Over functioning is where, and you tend to see this with people which have a real need to take everything on, hosting, organizing. They might be people pleasers and smoothing tension, managing logistics, who's picking who up, who's getting there, who's getting there. And they take things on in a controlling factor. And they're like, well, if I don't do it, then no one will get it done. Or, oh, I felt everyone was stressed, so I stepped in to sort it out. or they're the type of people that I didn't stop all day, it was a complete blur. And these clients are clients that are their behaviors are rooted in becoming overwhelmed. It's just something that they do, and they're not making a conscious choice. So when we think about how people might get stuck in these kind of like almost patterns, and it's about being able to regulate and support them regulating these higher intensity social events. And some of the tools we'll come on to bit on the call, but almost like stepping away from feeling that they are responsible for other people's emotions, which is quite a clear sign when a client is emotionally overloaded. It might not necessarily be their emotions that they're harboring, it might also be the responsibility of other people's emotions. And when they're in the environments they're in, providing some sort of harmony with their own capacity and being aware of it and being able to draw the line and not be habitually drawn into taking on more and more and more. Another reason why they might get stuck in these particular emotionally overloaded positions is that they don't have like a built-in pause point, or they haven't got a mantra of allowing themselves to step back out of the furore that can be happening in festive periods and give themselves a bit of a break. So again, we can bring that in as a tool and to kind of have a bit of a increased chance that these clients don't get stuck in these particular positions of emotional overload. And like I was saying, just a couple of these things from a coaching perspective, almost like micro regulation strategies that can happen at very small, particular points of the day. It could be pause points, whenever the tension's rising. You can take that 10-second pause out of the particular room or the house or the environment you're in. A lot can be used when you think about breathing and how people breathe and how, I've often, but I'm speaking with clients and they were saying like, they might notice other people, or they might feel like people don't breathe well when they're running around the house and sorting everything out. And it's like getting naturally that moment to pause and to breathe and to relax and to ground themselves in a sense of that within that being within that environment, but still be grounded through breathing. The exit cues is a great little strategy that being able to communicate effectively with the party that you're in and go, look, I'm going to take a quick moment, I'll be back in 10 minutes, but actually be quite forthright in doing that and push that into a conversation is quite a challenge sometimes, or within an environment. And having the capability of doing that will then allow for a sensory reset. So you're outside, say for example, going for a quick 10-minute walk, or just sitting on the bed for however long, it allows that person to kind of come out and actually have the five senses to calm, and the nervous system to go into the parasympathetic and kind of reset itself to a certain degree. So just touching base again on old family roles, because one thing that I have definitely realized over the years for myself personally, on the youngest of three siblings, but also a lot of the roles in that people have within family units can often be amplified or kicked back into use when you find yourself back in that environment, and the old familiar faces where you might find that you take it on the role of being a peacekeeper, where you're trying to keep everyone calm, but that's actually at your own cost. Sometimes you find that there's the responsible one who organises everything, anticipates everyone needs, gets things into play that needs to be in play. You might find that there are some people which have come back to the family environment or back to the friends and family environment, which are high achievers, and they're like, oh, look how well I'm doing. And conversely, the quiet one who kind of like keeps, small and in the corner and doesn't really say much. The mediator, there's very many different roles, and probably listening to this now, you might be able to have an indication of some of those roles yourselves. Personally, I know I'm very much a peacekeeper, more so. I used to be, less so now, but not in a um, antagonistic way. I just don't. I just take a step back from it. But you may hear some of those roles, and you may know people that or clients that fall into those categories, or even your own categories as well. And they often come from, the early scripts that happened when we were younger, and not necessarily the current ones. So when we're working with our clients, it's like, well, how do you go into a family system and then be able to almost resist that change back into those roles? The emotional memory is very powerful, so clients get stuck in that, what they remembered, where they're the little brother, or the big sister, or those kind of situations that can often cause a return to some of those responsibilities as well. And an old pattern can often be mistaken for an obligation. So just because how you once were doesn't mean that's how you need to be now. And even if you feel obligated to be like that, that's not the case. But that often comes with the fear of disruption. If you show up differently, if you make a different decision, or you're bringing yourself in a different way back into the festive period than you were maybe last year, then there is the fear of that's not going to sit well with everyone because they know you to be a certain way. That's your identity. So that can be a real problem. So when we think about the idea of how we would coach that and the moves to make as a coach, and I mentioned it just then, identity. And it's really important that when we're working with clients and they're going back into festive periods, parties, weddings, whatever the event may be, that they have a clear understanding of their identity and an awareness of that, and what they want to take intentionally into that particular uh, environment. So, you know, you can ask questions as a coach leading up to, and then also you can ask questions post the particular event or festive period. Just obviously reword them slightly. Say, who do you want to be this year? As in when you're going into this particular space, and when you're revisiting the session post festive period, how successful was your, turning up who you wanted to be within this period of time. What version of you feels aligned with your values today? What role um, were you tempted or likely to be tempted to be drawn back into? But what would be the cost of that? Now, and it's often the case of, if you're drawn back into that particular role, then and you feel uncomfortable and you feel misaligned, that's when the coping strategies kick in, or that's when you kind of like start to do, and have emotional um, withdrawals, or like numbing, or whatever the decisions that you make in order to be able to deal with that. So being drawn back into the roles can often be a big problem. How would your future self show up in that moment is a great question to ask when you're working with your clients in that sense. And boundary guilt. So sometimes we do have this, and I've covered this in some of the other calls leading up to this one, about this idea of having the fear of disappointing others, fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood, fear of appearing selfish, and fear of disrupting the tradition. I think is probably a good way of phrasing some of the guilt that comes with it. And it's not necessary, and it's not the boundary you're putting in place, it's the fear of something to do with that boundary. It's very rarely about the actual boundary itself, but the connotations or the consequences of what comes with it. But we see a lot of clients that get stuck in this position of saying yes, when actually what they're meaning to say is no, or maybe yes, but with certain parameters. And there is this spectrum of self-preservation, or selfishness, selfless and selfishness, and there's almost feels like if you don't play ball in some of these situations, you're being selfish. And that can be quite an undermining thought process for someone's decision making. So it can really destabilize someone's um, trajectory going into a festive period if they are feeling like I'm going to be selfish if I set this boundary. So framing it in, well, it's not selfishness, it's selfless, it's self-preservation. You are setting this up so when you go into it, you come out the other side of it with a better mental position, physical position, or whatever the um, aim or trajectory that that person's looking to come out of the other side. The person who gets stuck with boundary guilt is often someone who has a history of prioritizing the harmony of the situation over the authenticity of the situation. And we can often negate congruence in order to be able to keep things smooth sailing. And the client that has the people pleasing attribute, or at least in part leans into that space, will often be the client which will go with a certain amount of ideas into the festive period. And if they're not, have a strategic trajectory into that, can often come out and have all their boundaries have been dissolved. So these are the clients with a little bit of extra support will help them go into the festive period and have a little bit more of a fulfilling time, but also time that's more authentically aligned with them. Some of the moves we can make as a coach would be understanding that a boundary is a sign of growth and not wrongdoing, and using some reflections and some prompts around the things such as like guilt is to simply signal you're stepping out of an old role. And that can often reframe the feeling and emotion of guilt if it's tethered to a forward progression in a way which is beneficial for the individual themselves as a client. Um, when you think about the value of a boundary, you can tether it to what it's trying to protect and what it's trying to restore. So if you have about energy or about your um, if you have energy or time or resources in any way which you're looking to protect, which are very valuable to you, then tethering the boundary to that can often give it a little bit more potency when it comes to the festive periods where the ability to keep them in play can sometimes be a little bit more tricky. Just about trigger mapping, I've put Christmas here, but it can really be at any different period of time. So when we think about having a bit of an idea of when our triggers might come up and what they might to be, what they might likely be, you would be able to potentially see, what will be the recurring emotional challenge that could come up in the festive period, and that actually will help to map like a set of potential triggers, but also interactions, also environments that you would likely experience that could bring up various different emotions. When you tend to overextend yourself, that's something to be aware of as well. And when we're working with our clients, for them to have a certain amount of, yeah, I tend to overextend myself with my energy, or I always say, I'll make this, I'll make this, I'll make that, and you end up like having no time. If your clients are aware of where they tend to overextend themselves, we can then start to make a strategy in place for that. So the trigger mapping is really important. Reactively speaking, what happens when you're under stress? Do you avoid, do you appease, do you overfunction, do you shut down? Again, having that mapping of when there's that particular trigger in play, what then happens as a result of that. So this is very much, the Christmas trigger mapping is a lot about just building up an understanding for the client as an individual about what they're likely or potentially likely to do. Because then when you build something in place from a strategic point of view, that's how you can make sure you're on the right track. So one thing, just a little statement here, is when a client feels torn between what I want and what I should do, coaching helps orientate themselves towards values and not pressure. So do you feel that's value, or do you feel there's a pressure element to that? Do you feel that there is an alignment with that, or do you feel there is a coercion with that? And these are very important kind of differentiations to make when you're having coaching conversations with people, because some people are like, oh no, I really want to do that. And it's like, well, to you that might, or to others it might sound like that's an overextension, but it's actually in line with their values and it's not a pressure. So being able to have an honest and open conversation with your clients around like what is actually valuable to you, and give them the space to have that, and then give them the ability to say, well, actually, this is the pressure that is being put on me to do X, Y, and Z. So when a client feels torn between those, it's important to be able to differentiate what it is that they're being, the aspect that's being and tearing them into the two different directions they could be going, and ultimately for them to make a conscious decision around that. And we do that through value-led questions. So when we think about how some of the questions could be phrased, what matters to you most and how are you going to show up? What would you feel emotionally nourishing rather than emotionally draining? And where does the guilt come from? And whose story is it? Is it yours? Is it someone else's? Are you feeling the pressure because of this? And also having a clear indication of the values that you would be looking to maintain and protect during a festive period. And a lot of that can come down to being able to have decided parameters that you're going into, when it comes to food, alcohol, time you spend with people, conversations you're willing to have with people. A lot of what can happen is you get, especially when there's cross generations, you can sometimes get very different uh, opinions of subjects from different generations. And that in itself can be quite difficult for whoever it is to hear when it's not aligned with their values necessarily, and that can ultimately cause an emotional response. And then how that's dealt with and what where that goes to is the strategy that needs to be in place. And the 4 point framework here is more like the seasonal coaching frameworks. Like the reality check is a huge thing. People often can go blindly into a festive period and not really be fully connected about what this means. Turning up to a house with whatever 17, 18, 19, 25 people in can be like, oof, okay, this could be quite tricky. Conversely, turning up to returning back to a house that only has 4 of you in, again, that can be quite it can be quite tricky. So having that reality check about what's actually ahead, what we're going into, and giving a certain amount of emotional insight, like what is that going to feel like for me, and how is that going to come alive for me? What kind of things are going to come up? And again, we're just looking at that values alignment through the questioning, and then the boundaries and actions can consider small supportive steps that can build something in that will get them through that particular festive period. So just a little bit of a 4 point framework there. Now we're just going to discuss quickly some coaching go-to tools, or client go-to tools rather, that you can take through with some of your clients. Now, again, like I said, this is for the festive period, but Christmas, doesn't matter when it is, could be a family holiday, it could be weddings, christenings, bar mitzvahs, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, these tools can be applied across the range of different festive periods that you might find yourself in. 4 minute reset. Step 1, you breathe. Step 2, you ground. Step 3, you name the emotion. And then step 4, you choose and respond with the next step. So one big slow inhale, slower exhale, down regulate the stress, ease the tension off. Parasympathetic nervous system starts to come into play a little bit. Grounding, both feet on the floor, looking at being able to notice the weight distribution of your body, reconnecting mind and physicality together. If you're feeling anxious, name it. If you're feeling overstimulated, acknowledge it. If you're feeling pressure, observe it. And then give yourself the clarity to be able to reduce that emotional intensity. And it will be done through the next step that you choose, which would be stepping outside, pausing, saying no, asking for help, taking a break, um, and finding that agency around autonomy around the decision making in general. The good enough Christmas reframe. Now, a lot of people have this idea of what Christmas should be, this like kind of perfection of returning back to old times in the past and stuff, and that can really, when you hold what something should look like, perfect gifts, perfect mood, everyone's happy, joking, the perfect games session, the perfect articulate round. It doesn't really matter what it is, it's more to do with the idea that some things just have to be good enough. And what matters most is what is genuinely valuable to you. You know, that could be who you're with, that could be finding something that's imperfect but still meaningful, and being able to understand what expectations are at play rather than and that you would choose rather than an inherited from previous years or previous experiences. So the good enough Christmas reframe, and actually that can be applicable in many other different areas. The two yeses boundary rule, and a good one here when it comes to emotionally overloaded moments. So only say yes when your body and your mind both agree. And the mind yes is something more like what fits my values, what fits my priorities, does this? Yes. The body is, do I feel relaxed about this? Am I breathing with this? Is my stomach feeling good around this? And I mean, like from a knot, I don't mean from eating food, but like the kind of idea like the mind and the body is connected. And if it is, then it's a yes. And if it's not, then that's where the no has to come in with the, you know, your own robustness and being able to deliver that and stick by it. Now, I've often over the years brought this into play with a few different clients that come to mind that have worked particularly well, the emotional first aid plan. So it's almost like a little mini safety system that you can use in difficult moments. And, you want to create this ideally before Christmas begins, before the festive period, and a little practice time, but you can take it to different times of the year, different places, different scenarios can often work. This can often work really well. So in some senses, there are three things that we have within the uh, emotional first aid plan. Now, the first thing is like one person you can contact, and it's almost like if you're having a really difficult time, who can you reach out to? And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have like a 40-minute conversation with them. It can just be like a quick 3-minute call, or it can be just a series of messages that go back and forth just to help you. So someone that you know can help ground you, can help support you, and won't judge you. And if you're having something that you just need to reach out to them for, that they're able to kind of respond in a way. Um, the second part of the first aid kit is the exit strategy, a plan for stepping out of overwhelming moments. So having almost practiced a certain amount of verbalizing the thought, like I'm just going to go out and grab some air. I'll be back in 10 minutes, or you take your time out to back to the bedroom, I'm saying, or back into the bathroom or something, or a short walk, any of those things where you have that as an exit strategy, not a permanent exit strategy, but just a temporary exit strategy. And then the grounding rituals that you have as the third thing can be really useful when it comes to bringing the client back to themselves, taking 5 deep breaths. So a lot of like the sensory integration, touching a cold surface, repeating a calm phrase out loud. So you might want to do that in the bathroom as an exit strategy. Um, Hold a warm drink, place the hand on the chest and on the stomach, and just a few kind of like sensory touch, calming things there. And that can often work really well as a three-pronged attack when it comes to being able to support clients with a robust approach if they're finding the festive season tricky from an emotional point of view, and things are getting ahead of them. Now, the post festive dip. So sometimes people will often have really positive experiences or negative experiences, but there is a sense of intensity. And then, it could be a array of people and places, and then comes January and there's fatigue, there's sadness, there's a certain amount of emotional emptiness. There's almost like you've had such a purpose leading up to Christmas if you've been channeled into doing lots of different things, and then that's suddenly removed, and that can be quite difficult for people. January blues, for example, could be to do if you've kind of like seen people that you're not going to see for another year. That's quite sad. Or you spent a load of money. That's quite sad, depending. But then you're in a situation where that momentum has disappeared, the social aspects, and then it's a time to recalibrate, and that can be quite a sharp recalibration. So coming out of that psychological rebound where you're in a space which is quite low or in an ebb, so to speak, as a coach, acknowledging that and having conversations around that and like bringing the right kind of focus for what's ahead, from a training perspective, from a life perspective, and having the transition into the new year and having a focus which is gentle but directive and not ambiguous or loose or with no sense of direction. So having a post-Christmas decompression plan is often uh, useful, and having that outlined before can be very productive. So allowing and kind of bringing in acceptance of rest. So when there's a recharge that's needed post Christmas, don't feel like you've got to go straight into getting back to full on training or full on work or full on anything. There is this kind of opportunity to take time to rest. And it shouldn't be seen as a negative, which can create a dip. It should be seen as a positive, which can maintain someone's mental well-being, physical well-being. Reflecting over Reflections are often a good idea, and it creates a learning cycle around throughout the festive period. What went well, what felt nourishing, what was draining, what would you do different next year? What aspects came up that were troubling or tricky, and how did you deal with them? All of these things from a reflective point of view. If someone was having a bit of a tricky time over the festive period, coming back out of it, they're able to focus on the fact that they've learned something and not be consumed or ruminate over things that might have happened. And we can link this with the help model. What happened, what emotions were there, what did you learn, what would be the plan next time you go into a festive period or a time when lots of people come back together to celebrate or whatever it might be. And then the return to routine, where you might want to anchor yourself to some really good fundamental actions, hydration, bit of walking. I mean, some people go for Christmas walks, which is great. So the continuation of that, um, resetting when you're going to bed, the routine, lighter meals, and then coming back into like light exercise, into some more focused work, for example, rebuilding that routine after the disruption of the routine leading into the festive period or during the festive period. And that decompression time after, it's not you being indulgent or the client being indulgent. It's about the client having the opportunity just to reset and recalibrate the nervous system before they go into the next part of what they are looking to achieve in that new year. So while the festive period might seem like you're preparing for battle after this particular call, it's not necessarily that. There are a lot of positive experiences and emotions that can come from this time of year for people. And when we're thinking about working with people's positive emotions, often going into a festive period, helping the clients be able to find gratitude, the opportunity for them to experience and express love, having and the opportunity to deliver kindness and to be able to receive kindness as well within that particular time of festivity. You've got the opportunity to be creative, and this I think is important when we think about gifting and being able to bring things to a festive period. If you're supporting people, what things can I make? What things can I, you know, enjoy and do. It could be playing the piano at the party or whatever it might be, and then maintaining optimism, especially through a time of year that can be very difficult. It also can be seen as a time where new ideas are created, are spoken about, um, new relationships are made. It can be a time when old relationships are rekindled, and it's important that our clients can feel optimism going into this time of year as well. And we might look at the festive plan, and like I said at the beginning of this call, Christmas is one. There are many across different cultures and nationalities where these particular considerations are really prevalent to be made. The idea of what people might be facing, also the strategies that can be in place, the tools that can be applied accordingly. So it's not necessarily about this is just for Christmas. It is about this is what's leading up to a festive period or a gathering or anything like that. These things can be used. And also, it's about afterwards as well. So, what and how can some of these thoughts and considerations be applied when the person comes back from a festive period or back from a time where they've met family or they've been at parties and so on and so forth? So I hope you found this call useful, and I hope it's been insightful enough, made you potentially reflect as a coach with what you might want to do with your clients. As an individual, there's some ideas that you can take away. And if you are in a team-based scenario, then you can think about those people that you're working with. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the new year.